The smell hit Owen Briggs before he even opened the storage bay door. 6 years working with animals across 3 different planets had taught him to recognize the scent of neglect and suffering. He stopped in the dimly lit corridor of Station Gamma 7's lower cargo level, his hand hovering over the access panel. This was supposed to be a simple inspection. The station administrator had offered him several spaces for his new veterinary clinic, and this section of the cargo bay was the largest. Owen had arrived on the station just 2 days ago, eager to start his practice in a place where dozens of alien species lived and worked together. Where there were aliens, there were animals. And where there were animals, they needed care. He pressed the panel. The door slid open with a hiss that echoed through the empty space beyond. The cargo bay stretched out before him, filled with abandoned crates and equipment covered in dust. Emergency lights cast long shadows across the floor. Owen stepped inside, his boots making soft sounds against the metal grating. The smell grew stronger. Not just old and stale, but something else. Something alive and sick. That a sound came from the far corner. A soft whimper, almost too quiet to hear. Owen moved toward it, pulling out his portable light. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across forgotten cargo containers until it found something that made him stop dead. Chains. Heavy metal chains bolted to the floor, and at the end of those chains, a creature that should not have been there. The dwarf dragon was small, maybe the size of a large dog, with scales that might have once been bright blue, but now looked dull and gray. Its wings were folded tight against its sides, and Owen could see where the feathers had fallen out in patches. The creature's ribs showed through its skin. One of its legs was bent at an odd angle, clearly broken and healed wrong. Infected wounds covered its body, oozing and untreated. The dragon lifted its head as Owen approached, and he saw its eyes. They were clouded with pain and fever, but there was something else there too. Intelligence. Awareness. This was not just some mindless beast. IT growled weakly, trying to back away, but the chains only allowed it to move a few feet. The metal collar around its neck had rubbed the scales away, leaving raw, bleeding skin. Owen felt his stomach turn. He had seen sick animals before. He had seen injured animals. But he had never seen anything deliberately left to suffer like this. That he knelt down slowly, keeping his movements calm and steady. The dragon watched him with those clouded eyes, trembling. Owen pulled out his medical scanner and ran a quick check from a safe distance. The readings made his jaw clench. Severe malnutrition, multiple infections, broken bones that had never been set, dehydration. This creature was dying, slowly and painfully. Owen stood and walked back to the corridor, his mind racing. He found a wall panel and accessed the station's records. It took him 20 minutes of searching, but he found what he was looking for. The dragon had been registered to a Talveen merchant named Rook. The records showed it had been brought to the station 8 months ago as a cargo handler. Small dragons were used by the Talveen for moving freight in tight spaces where machinery could not reach. But 6 months ago, the dragon had been logged as sick and unfit for work. Rook had left the station 4 months ago, destination unknown. The dragon had been chained in that bay ever since. Owen went straight to the station administrator's office. The administrator was a Helvan, a species that looked like tall, thin birds with 4 arms. His name was Creek, and he listened to Owen's report with what seemed like genuine concern. "I am sorry you had to see that," Creek said, his translator making his voice sound flat and mechanical. "The situation is unfortunate." Unfortunate. Owen kept his voice level. "That animal has been chained down there for months, sick and starving. We need to get it medical treatment immediately." Creek's feathers ruffled, a sign of discomfort. The dragon is still registered as property of Rook. Station law prevents us from interfering with private property, even abandoned property. We have tried to contact Rook, but he has not responded to any messages. That creature is suffering. I understand your feelings, Dr. Briggs. Humans are known for their strong reactions to animal distress. But this is a Talveen matter. In their culture, dwarf dragons are work animals, nothing more. They do not view them the way your species does. Owen leaned forward. "I don't care about cultural differences. That dragon is in pain. It needs help now." Creek's four hands made a gesture that Owen's translator interpreted as regret. I cannot authorize you to treat it. The legal issues will be complex. If Rook returns and finds his property has been altered without permission, the station could face significant problems. And if it dies, then the property would be disposed of according to standard procedures. Creek's tone was matter-of-fact, not cruel. He was simply stating how things worked. Owen left the office feeling sick. He walked through the station's busy markets, past aliens of a dozen different species buying and selling goods, talking and laughing. Life going on as normal while something suffered in the darkness below. He returned to his temporary quarters and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall. His medical bag sat in the corner, packed with supplies. Everything he needed to help that dragon was right there. The law said he could not touch it. Cultural protocol said he should not interfere. Common sense said getting involved would only cause him problems. Owen thought about those clouded eyes looking up at him. The weak growl of a creature too sick to even defend itself properly. The raw wounds and broken bones left untreated because someone had decided this life was not worth saving. He grabbed his medical bag and stood up. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing were not the same thing. And Owen had not become a veterinarian to follow rules. He had become one to help creatures that could not help themselves, that he would go back tonight, and he would do what needed to be done. Owen waited until the station's night cycle began. The corridors grew quieter as businesses closed and most residents returned to their quarters. He carried his medical bag in one hand and a container of food in the other, moving quickly through the dimly lit passages toward the lower cargo levels. His heart pounded as he approached the storage bay. What he was about to do could cost him his license, maybe even get him expelled from the station. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw that dragon's face, saw the pain and hopelessness in its clouded eyes. The bay door opened with the same hiss as before. Owen stepped inside and made his way to the far corner where the chains rattled softly in the darkness. The dragon was awake. It lifted its head as Owen's light found it and immediately tried to scramble backward. The chains pulled tight. The creature made a sound between a hiss and a whimper, baring its teeth despite being too weak to pose any real threat. "Easy," Owen said softly, setting down his bag in the food container. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dragon did not understand his words, but it seemed to hear something in his tone. It stopped pulling against the chains, though its body remained tense and ready to flee. Owen sat down on the floor about 10 feet away. He opened the food container slowly, making sure the dragon could see every movement. Inside was a mixture of protein paste and nutritional supplements, specially formulated for carnivorous species. He scooped some onto a plate and slid it across the floor toward the dragon. The creature stared at the food, then at Owen, then back at the food. Its nostrils flared, catching the scent. Hunger won over fear. It lunged forward and began eating frantically, making small, desperate sounds as it swallowed. Owen watched, keeping very still. The dragon ate everything on the plate in less than a minute, then looked up at him with those clouded eyes, still wary but less hostile than before. "Good," Owen murmured. He prepared another portion, smaller this time. Too much food too fast would make the dragon sick after months of starvation. He slid the second plate forward. Again, the dragon ate quickly, but this time it did not seem quite as desperate. When it finished, it settled back on its haunches, watching Owen with what might have been confusion. Nobody had been kind to it in a very long time. Owen spent the next hour just sitting there, talking softly about nothing in particular. His voice seemed to calm the creature. Slowly, carefully, he moved a few feet closer. The dragon tensed, but did not try to flee. Another few minutes passed. Owen moved closer again, that'd be why the end of the first visit. He was close enough to see the full extent of the dragon's injuries in the light from his medical scanner. What he saw made him angry. This was not just neglect. This was cruelty born of indifference, which was somehow worse. He did not try to touch the dragon that night. Trust had to be built slowly. Owen returned the next night with more food and water. The dragon was waiting, and this time it did not try to back away when he entered. It watched him with obvious hunger as he prepared the meal that on the third night. The dragon moved toward him when he sat down. Not close, but closer than before. It ate from the plate while Owen sat just a few feet away, and when it finished, it did not immediately retreat. Instead, it tilted its head, studying him with eyes that looked slightly less clouded than before. "You are starting to feel better, are you not?" Owen said quietly. The dragon's ears twitched at the sound of his voice that on the fourth night, Owen brought his medical supplies. The dragon had grown comfortable enough with his presence that it did not panic when he opened his bag. Owen moved very slowly, pulling out antiseptic and bandages. "I need to treat those wounds," he said, showing the dragon the supplies. "This might hurt a little, but it will help. I promise." The dragon watched as Owen inched closer. When he reached out his hand, the creature flinched but did not snap or try to bite. Owen let his hand hover in the air for a moment, then gently touched the dragon's shoulder, away from any of the wounds. The dragon's whole body went rigid. Owen kept his hand there, steady and warm, until he felt the tension start to ease. Then, moving with extreme care, he began cleaning the infected wounds on the dragon's back. The creature made small sounds of pain but held still. Owen worked as quickly as he could without being rough, applying antiseptic and covering the worst wounds with protective bandages. The dragon's breathing was fast and shallow, but it seemed to understand that Owen was helping. "Good," Owen whispered. "You're doing so good." When he finished, the dragon looked at him with something new in its eyes. Not just confusion or hunger, but perhaps the beginning of trust. On the fifth night, Owen arrived to find the dragon waiting near the edge of its chain length, as close to the entrance as it could get. When it saw him, it made a sound that was almost welcoming. Owen smiled. "Hello to you too." He was setting down the food when he heard footsteps behind him. Owen spun around, his heart jumping into his throat that a massive Belron stood in the doorway. The species was built like walking tanks, with thick armored skin and 4 powerful arms. This one wore a security uniform. His name tag read Tross. Owen's mind raced. This was it. He had been caught. Everything he had worked for was about to collapse. Tross looked at Owen. Then he looked at the dragon, which had shrunk back against the wall, trembling. Then he looked at the medical supplies and food scattered on the floor. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours. Finally, Tross spoke, his deep voice rumbling through the translator. "How long have you been doing this?" Owen stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible. 5 days. The administrator told you not to interfere." "Yes." "You know you could lose your license." "Yes." Tross was quiet for another long moment. Then he stepped into the bay and let the door close behind him. Owen's heart sank. This was it, but Tross did not pull out restraints or call for backup. Instead, he walked over to the dragon and knelt down, moving with surprising gentleness for someone so large. The dragon pressed itself against the wall, terrified. "I walk past this bay every night on my rounds," Tross said quietly. "I hear it crying sometimes. I filed 3 reports asking for permission to help. All denied." He looked up at Owen. "You are breaking the law." "I know." Tross nodded slowly. "Good. Keep breaking it. I will make sure my rounds take longer in this sector. I will not see anything that happens here." He stood and walked toward the door, then paused. "What you're doing is right. The law is not always right." Then he was gone, and Owen was alone with the dragon again, his hands shaking with relief. Word traveled fast on a space station. Owen learned this the hard way when he opened his new clinic 2 weeks after he started treating the dragon, that he had finally found a proper space on the station's 2nd level, a small but clean facility with examination rooms and equipment storage. The sign outside read, "Briggs Veterinary Services, all species welcome." Owen had spent 3 days setting everything up, organizing supplies, and calibrating his medical scanners for different alien physiologies. His first official patient was a Quinn's pet, a small furry creature that needed its teeth cleaned. The procedure went well, and the Quinn paid him with sincere thanks. Owen felt hopeful. Maybe he could build a good practice here. Maybe everything would work out. Then the Talveen delegation arrived. There were 3 of them, tall and thin with gray skin and cold eyes that looked reptilian. They wore expensive robes that marked them as merchants of high standing. The leader's name was Sark, and his voice was sharp with anger. "You are the human who has been interfering with Talveen property. Sark said without greeting or introduction. Owen had been wiping down an examination table. He set down his cloth carefully, keeping his face neutral. I have been providing medical care to a suffering animal, a dragon that belongs to one of our people. You had no right to touch it. The owner abandoned it months ago. That dragon was dying. Sark's eyes narrowed. What we do with our property is our concern, not yours. Dwarf dragons are work animals. When they can no longer work, they have no value. This is how it has always been. That does not make it right. Right? Sark's voice rose. You dare to lecture us about right? You are a guest on this station, human. You have no authority to impose your primitive emotional responses on our cultural practices. Owen felt his temper flare, but kept it under control. Preventing suffering is not a cultural practice. It is basic decency. The dragon is property, no different than a broken tool, except it can feel pain. It can suffer. It has a mind. Sark made a dismissive gesture. Sentimentality. We have filed a formal complaint with the station administrator. You will cease all contact with the dragon immediately, or we will have you expelled from this station and blacklisted from every trading post in this sector. The three Talveen left without waiting for a response. Owen stood alone in his clinic, hands clenched at his sides. The complaint led to a tribunal hearing 3 days later. Owen sat in a small conference room with Creek the administrator, Sark, and 2 other Talveen representatives, and a neutral arbiter from the station's legal services. The arbiter, of Vreen with purple scales and multiple eye stalks, reviewed the case files on a datapad. Dr. Briggs, you are accused of unlawfully interfering with registered property. How do you respond? I provided emergency medical care to a dying animal. Owen said clearly. The owner abandoned it 6 months ago and has not responded to any contact attempts. Under those circumstances, I believe I had a moral obligation to help. Moral obligations do not supersede property law, the arbiter said. The dragon remains registered to its owner. Without his explicit permission, you had no legal right to treat it. Sark leaned forward. We demand that this human be expelled from the station and that the dragon be disposed of according to proper procedures. Disposed of? Owen felt his voice rise despite his efforts to stay calm. You mean killed? It has no value. Keeping it alive wastes resources. Owen turned to the arbiter. I am requesting that the tribunal review the cognitive capacity of dwarf dragons. I believe they demonstrate sufficient intelligence to qualify for protected status under Galactic Sentience Preservation Acts. The room went silent. Even Creek looked surprised. Sark's face darkened with anger. Absurd. Dwarf dragons are animals. They have been used as work beasts for thousands of years. So are many species that are now recognized as sentient. Owen said, just because something has been done a certain way does not mean it should continue. I have spent 2 weeks working with this dragon. It demonstrates complex problem solving, emotional responses, and clear communication attempts. It understands cause and effect. It remembers and learns from experience. The arbiter's eye stalks swiveled to look at different participants. This is a serious claim, Dr. Briggs. Do you have evidence? I have detailed medical records and behavioral observations. I could provide them all. I'm also requesting time to consult with xenobiologists who specialize in animal cognition. The arbiter was quiet for a long moment. This tribunal will adjourn for 1 week while Dr. Briggs prepares his evidence. Until then, the dragon will remain in its current location, and Dr. Briggs will be permitted to continue providing medical care under supervised conditions. Sark stood abruptly. This is outrageous. You are allowing this human to mock our entire culture. I am following proper legal procedure, the arbiter said calmly. If Dr. Briggs can demonstrate that dwarf dragons possess cognitive capacity above standard animal intelligence, then this case becomes much more complex. We will reconvene in 7 days. Owen left the hearing with his hands shaking. He had bought himself time, but now he had to prove something that might be impossible to prove. And even if he succeeded, the Talveen would never forgive him. That night, he went to see the dragon as usual. The creature had improved dramatically over the past 2 weeks. Its wounds were healing, its eyes were clear, and it had gained back some weight. Most importantly, it seemed happy to see Owen. When he entered the bay, The dragon made a soft chirping sound and moved toward him as far as the chains allowed. Owen knelt down, and the dragon pressed its head against his chest, a gesture it had started doing a few days ago. "I'm trying to help you," Owen said quietly, stroking the dragon's scales. "But I need you to help me too. I need to show them that you are more than just a work animal. Can you do that?" The dragon looked up at him with intelligent eyes and made another soft sound. Then it did something it had never done before. It gently placed one clawed foot on Owen's hand, a deliberate gesture that felt almost like a handshake. Owen felt a lump form in his throat. "Okay," he whispered. "We will do this together." He spent the rest of the night running cognitive tests, documenting every response, every sign of intelligence. The dragon cooperated fully, as if it somehow understood what was at stake. By morning, Owen had filled 3 data pads with observations. It was not enough, not yet, but it was a start. He sent messages to every xenobiologist and animal cognition expert he could find in human space, begging for help, for research, for anything that might save this creature's life. Some replied with sympathy, but could not help. Others did not reply at all, but one message came back that gave him hope. A researcher named Dr. Lin had studied dwarf dragons 15 years ago and had evidence that supported Owen's claims. She was sending all her data immediately. Owen read through Dr. Lin's research files with growing excitement. She had documented tool use, social bonding, and even what appeared to be a form of empathic sensitivity in dwarf dragons. The Talveen had suppressed her findings, discredited her work, and driven her out of their space. But the research was solid. It was exactly what Owen needed. He looked at the dragon, which had fallen asleep with its head resting near his leg. "We might actually have a chance," he whispered. Owen barely slept during the week before the second tribunal hearing. He spent every free moment working with the dragon, documenting behaviors and running tests. What he discovered amazed him more each day. The dragon, which he had started calling Pip in his private notes, showed clear signs of complex thinking. When Owen set up simple puzzles involving food rewards, Pip solved them quickly and then seemed to remember the solutions for future attempts. More impressively, Pip started creating variations on the puzzles, as if playing or experimenting. But it was the emotional connection that struck Owen most deeply. Pip responded to his moods with uncanny accuracy. When Owen felt stressed or worried, the dragon would press close to him and make soft, comforting sounds. When Owen was happy, Pip seemed to mirror that joy with energetic movements and cheerful chirps that on the 4th night of testing, something remarkable happened. Owen had been looking at his data pad, frowning at some research that contradicted what he needed to prove. He felt frustrated and tired. Pip had been lying across the bay, apparently resting. Suddenly, the dragon got up and walked over to Owen. Without any prompting, Pip gently took the data pad from Owen's hands using its mouth, set it aside, then climbed into Owen's lap and curled up there. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly meant to comfort, that Owen felt tears spring to his eyes. "You understand, do not you?" he whispered, stroking Pip's scales. "You know I'm trying to help you." Pip made a soft sound and closed its eyes, completely trusting. Owen added this observation to his growing file of evidence. Empathic response, emotional intelligence. These were not the behaviors of a simple work animal. The more time he spent with Pip, the more convinced he became that dwarf dragons had been terribly misunderstood. They were not just intelligent. They were sensitive, aware beings capable of forming deep emotional bonds. The way the Talveen treated them was not just cruel. It was a fundamental denial of what these creatures truly were. On the 6th night, Tross stopped by during his security rounds. The big Belron had become a regular visitor, often bringing treats or supplies for Pip. He stood watching as the dragon performed one of Owen's cognitive tests, using its small claws to manipulate objects in a specific sequence to earn a reward. "The Talveen are angry," Tross said quietly. "They're putting pressure on the administrator to rule against you regardless of evidence." Owen looked up from his notes. "Can they do that? They have significant economic influence on the station. Creek is a fair administrator, but he has to consider the station's interests. If the Talveen threaten to take their business elsewhere, Many people here will lose income. So even if I prove Pip is sentient, it might not matter. Tross was quiet for a moment. Politics often defeats justice. But that does not mean you should stop trying. What you're doing here matters. Even if you lose at the tribunal, people are watching. People are talking. Some of us are starting to question things we never questioned before. That night, Owen received a message that changed everything. The Galactic Council's Ethics Committee had heard about the case and was sending an investigator to observe the second tribunal hearing. They wanted to see the evidence for themselves. Owen felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. This was far bigger than he had imagined. If the Ethics Committee ruled in Pip's favor, it could change things for all dwarf dragons across the galaxy. But if they ruled against him, it would set a precedent that would be almost impossible to overcome. The seventh day arrived. Owen prepared Pip carefully, making sure the dragon was clean and healthy looking. Pip's transformation over the past 3 weeks was remarkable. The dull gray scales had regained their blue color. The infected wounds had healed, leaving only faint scars. Pip had gained weight and moved with energy and grace. Most importantly, the fear in Pip's eyes had been replaced with alertness and curiosity. The tribunal reconvened in a larger chamber this time to accommodate the observers from the Ethics Committee. The lead investigator was a Quinn named First Leaf, an elderly being with bark-like skin and wise eyes that seemed to see everything. Owen presented his evidence methodically. He showed videos of Pip solving puzzles. He presented Dr. Lin's research. He shared his own observations of emotional intelligence and empathic responses. He spoke about how Pip had transformed from a terrified, suffering creature into a healthy, happy being capable of joy and trust. This is not a work animal, Owen concluded. This is a sentient being who has been denied the most basic rights because of outdated cultural assumptions. Sark stood to present the Talveen counterargument. This human has spent weeks conditioning the dragon to perform tricks. Any animal can be trained. This proves nothing about sentience. Dwarf dragons have been used as work beasts for millennia. Our entire economy in certain sectors depends on their labor. We cannot allow emotional manipulation to override thousands of years of tradition and law. First Leaf listened to both sides without expression. Then the investigator spoke in a gentle but firm voice. I would like to observe the dragon directly before making any recommendations. Everyone moved to the cargo bay where Pip waited. Owen had left the dragon with food and water, but had not been able to spend time there that morning due to the hearing. He felt nervous. Would Pip perform as needed? Would First Leaf see what Owen saw? As soon as the bay door opened, Pip looked up and spotted Owen in the crowd. The dragon's whole demeanor changed. Pip made a happy sound and moved toward Owen as far as the chains allowed, clearly eager to greet him. Owen walked forward slowly, aware that everyone was watching. He knelt down, and Pip immediately pressed against him, making soft, contented noises. Then the dragon noticed the strangers and moved partially behind Owen, peeking out at them with cautious but curious eyes. That First Leaf approached slowly. May I interact with the dragon? Yes, Owen said, but please move slowly. Pip is still nervous around new people. First Leaf knelt down at a respectful distance. The investigator held out one hand, palm up, and waited. Pip watched from behind Owen's shoulder, considering. Then, after a long moment, Pip slowly crept forward. The dragon sniffed First Leaf's hand carefully, then made a questioning sound. First Leaf remained perfectly still. I mean you no harm, small one. Pip tilted its head, studying the Quinn's face. Then the dragon did something that made Owen's heart race. Pip reached out one clawed foot and gently touched First Leaf's hand. The same gesture Pip had used with Owen. First Leaf's eyes widened slightly. The investigator looked at Owen. How long has the dragon been making deliberate gestural communication? About a week, Owen said. Pip uses different gestures to indicate different meanings. That one means greeting or acknowledgement. First Leaf stood slowly. I have seen enough. The tribunal will reconvene tomorrow for my official statement. That night, Owen could not eat or sleep. Everything depended on what First Leaf would say. The tribunal chamber was packed. Word had spread throughout the station that the Ethics Committee would deliver their findings today. Owen sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together. Across the aisle, Sark and the other Talveen representatives sat with expressions of cold confidence. The First Leaf entered the chamber with two other ethics committee members. The room fell silent as they took their positions. The elderly Quinn's face was unreadable. The arbiter called the session to order. First Leaf of the Galactic Council Ethics Committee, you have observed the evidence and the subject in question. What are your findings? First Leaf stood slowly, with the deliberate movements of someone who had lived a very long time. I have reviewed all submitted evidence. I have observed the dragon called Pip directly. I have consulted with xenobiologists and cognitive specialists. I have also reviewed the historical treatment of dwarf dragons across multiple cultures. The investigator paused, and Owen felt like his heart might stop. My findings are complex, First Leaf continued. From a purely technical standpoint, dwarf dragons demonstrate cognitive abilities that fall into a category we might call borderline sentience. They show problem-solving skills, emotional responses, and rudimentary communication. However, these traits alone do not necessarily qualify them for full sentient status under current galactic law. Owen felt his hope crumbling. Sark looked satisfied, but First Leaf was not finished. However, during my observation, I witnessed something that cannot be explained by simple animal behavior. The dragon Pip demonstrated what I can only describe as empathic awareness. It responded to emotional states in others with deliberate, comforting actions. It made gestural communications that showed clear intentionality. Most significantly, it showed the capacity for trust despite severe trauma. First Leaf turned to look directly at Owen. Dr. Briggs asked me a question yesterday that I have been considering carefully. He said, how do we measure the value of a life? This is not a scientific question. It is a philosophical one. The room was absolutely silent. The Talveen argue that tradition and economic necessity justify their treatment of dwarf dragons, First Leaf said. But I must ask, what kind of civilization builds its prosperity on the suffering of beings capable of feeling pain and forming emotional bonds? What does it say about us if we choose efficiency over compassion? Sark stood abruptly. You are allowing emotion to cloud your judgment. This is exactly what we warned against. The human has manipulated this entire process. First Leaf's expression remained calm. I'm not finished, Representative Sark. The Quinn's voice carried quiet authority that made Sark sit back down, though his face was dark with anger. I do not believe Dr. Briggs has manipulated anything, First Leaf continued. What I have witnessed is a human demonstrating a principle that his species seems to understand better than most. The measure of a civilization is not how it treats its equals, but how it treats those who cannot defend themselves. First Leaf looked around the chamber. Yes, dwarf dragons may be less intelligent than most sentient species. Yes, they have been used as work animals for thousands of years. But neither of these facts justifies cruelty. Neither justifies abandoning a suffering creature to die in chains. The dragon is property, Sark insisted. This human had no right to interfere. And here we reach the heart of the matter, First Leaf said. Can a being capable of suffering, capable of trust, capable of emotional bonds, truly be considered property? This is the question that must be answered not just for this one dragon, but for all dwarf dragons. The other ethics committee members conferred quietly with First Leaf. Owen watched, barely breathing. Finally, First Leaf spoke again. The ethics committee cannot overturn Talveen property laws. That is beyond our authority. However, we can and do declare that dwarf dragons demonstrate sufficient cognitive and emotional capacity to qualify for protected status under the Galactic Sentience Preservation Acts, subsection 12, which covers borderline sentient species. The chamber erupted in noise. Sark was shouting. Other observers were talking excitedly. The arbiter had to call for order 3 times. When the room finally quieted, First Leaf continued. This means that while dwarf dragons may still be used for work in cultures that permit it, they must be provided with adequate food, water, shelter, and medical care. Abandonment or deliberate cruelty will be considered a violation of galactic law. Any dwarf dragon that is abandoned or abused must be surrendered to authorized care facilities. This is an outrage. Sart's voice rang through the chamber. You are destroying our cultural practices. You are imposing human values on species who do not share them. First Leaf turned to face the Talveen directly. I'm not imposing human values. I am applying universal principles. The capacity to suffer exists across all species. The desire to avoid pain is not cultural, it is biological. What Dr. Briggs did was not about imposing his culture. It was about responding to suffering with compassion. If that is a uniquely human trait, then perhaps other species should learn from it. The words hung in the air like a challenge. As for the dragon called Pip, First Leaf said, since its registered owner abandoned it and has not responded to contact attempts, and since it was found in conditions that violate the new welfare standards, it is hereby emancipated and placed in the permanent care of Dr. Owen Briggs, who has demonstrated both the ability and the willingness to provide proper care. Owen felt tears spring to his eyes. He had won. Pip was free. But as he looked at Sark's furious face, he knew this was far from over. The Talveen would not accept this quietly, and the implications of First Leaf's ruling would ripple across the galaxy. That night, Owen went to the cargo bay. He had brought tools to remove the chains. Pip watched with curious eyes as Owen worked on the locks, finally understanding what all the earlier testing and observations had been for. When the last chain fell away, Pip stood still for a moment, as if not quite believing it was real. Then the dragon looked at Owen and made a sound that might have been joy. Owen knelt down, and Pip rushed to him, pressing close. For the first time, there were no chains, no restrictions, just a free being choosing to be near someone who cared. You are safe now, Owen whispered. I promise. Outside the bay, he could hear raised voices. The Talveen were organizing a protest. Other species were taking sides. The station was dividing into those who supported First Leaf's ruling and those who opposed it. Change was never easy. But as Owen held Pip close, feeling the dragon's steady breathing, he knew it was necessary. Some things were worth fighting for, and the right to live without suffering was one of them, no matter what species you were. 3 months had passed since First Leaf's ruling, and Station Gamma 7 had transformed in ways Owen never expected. His veterinary clinic was now the busiest medical facility on the station. The waiting area was filled with aliens of different species, each holding or leading some kind of creature that needed care. A Vreen had brought in a sick herd animal. A Helvan waited with an injured avian that served as a message carrier. Even a few Quinn had started bringing their botanical companions, creatures that were half plant and half animal, requiring specialized knowledge to treat. But the most significant change was happening in the corner of the clinic that Owen had converted into a sanctuary space. Pip was there now, playing with 3 other dwarf dragons that had been surrendered to Owen's care in the weeks following the tribunal. The first had come from a Talveen merchant who wanted to avoid legal trouble. The dragon had been old and arthritic, barely able to work anymore. Owen had treated its joint pain and given it a comfortable place to rest. The second had been found on a cargo ship, malnourished and scared. The third had simply been dropped off at the clinic door with a note that said, "Cannot afford new welfare requirements." Pip had greeted each new dragon with gentle curiosity, as if understanding they had suffered similar trauma. Now all 4 rested together in a heated enclosure, well fed and healing. Owen watched them through the observation window as he finished examining a patient. Pip had become something of a leader to the other dragons, showing them that humans could be trusted, that this place was safe. Dr. Briggs, his assistant, a young Belron named Moss, appeared in the doorway. You have a visitor. She says she is from the Galactic Council. Owen's heart skipped. He washed his hands and went to the reception area. First Leaf stood there, looking around the busy clinic with what might have been approval. Dr. Briggs, I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all, Owen said, gesturing toward his office. Please come in. They sat down across from each other. First Leaf was quiet for a moment, then spoke. I wanted to inform you personally of some developments. The Ethics Committee's ruling on dwarf dragons has created significant controversy, as you are aware. Owen nodded. The past 3 months had been difficult. Some Talveen had left the station in protest. Others had adapted, grumbling but following the new welfare standards. A few had even started treating their dragons better and discovered that healthy, happy animals actually worked more efficiently. However, First Leaf continued. The ruling has also inspired change beyond what we anticipated. 17 different species have begun reviewing their treatment of work animals. 6 have already implemented new welfare standards. And we have received over 400 reports of abandoned or abused dwarf dragons from across the galaxy. Owen felt overwhelmed. 400? Yes. The Galactic Council is establishing sanctuary facilities on major stations and planets to care for them. We would like you to help train the staff who will run these facilities. Your methods, your understanding of how to rehabilitate traumatized dragons are needed. I am just a veterinarian, Owen said. I only did what seemed right. First Leaf's expression softened. You did what many species forgot how to do. You saw suffering and chose to act, despite the personal cost. That is not a small thing, Dr. Briggs. That is the foundation of true civilization. The Quinn stood slowly. There is one more thing. The Council wants to formally recognize your work. They are creating a new position, an advocate for the welfare of borderline sentient species. We would like you to consider accepting this role. Owen was speechless. I do not know what to say. Say you will think about it, First Leaf said gently. But know that what you started here is spreading. You have reminded the galaxy that compassion is not weakness, that kindness has value, that how we treat the most vulnerable among us defines who we are. After First Leaf left, Owen sat alone in his office for a long time. He thought about that first night in the cargo bay, seeing Pip chained and suffering. He thought about the choice he had made to break the rules, to risk everything, simply because he could not walk away from a creature in pain. That choice had changed his life. But more importantly, it had changed things for creatures who could not speak for themselves. That he got up and went to the sanctuary area. Pip looked up as he entered and made a happy chirping sound. The dragon trotted over, and Owen knelt down to greet his friend properly. The other 3 dragons watched from a distance, still learning to trust. But they were getting better every day. The old one had started playing again, something Owen suspected it had not done in years. The malnourished one was gaining weight. The scared one was beginning to explore its environment with tentative curiosity. We did it, Owen said softly to Pip. We actually did it. Pip pressed against him, making contented sounds. Then the dragon did something new. It carefully reached up and touched Owen's face with one gentle claw, a gesture of such clear affection that Owen felt his eyes sting with tears. Moss appeared in the doorway. Dr. Briggs? Your next patient is ready. And there is someone at the door with another dragon. She says it was abandoned at a cargo depot. Owen looked at Pip. I need to go work. Will you be okay here? Pip made a soft sound and returned to the other dragons, settling down near the old one as if to keep it company. Owen smiled and went back to work. The clinic was busy. There were creatures to heal, dragons to rescue, and apparently, a galaxy to change one act of kindness at a time. That evening, as the station's artificial lights dimmed to simulate night, Owen locked up the clinic and prepared to head to his quarters. Pip had chosen to stay in the sanctuary area with the other dragons rather than follow Owen home. It was a sign of growing independence, of healing that went beyond just physical recovery. Before leaving, Owen stopped to check on them one last time. All 4 dragons were curled together in a pile, breathing slowly in sleep. Pip's scales gleamed healthy blue in the soft light. There were no chains, no wounds, no fear. Just 4 beings who had been given a second chance at life because someone decided they mattered. Owen turned off the lights and headed home, knowing he would be back tomorrow to do it all again. There were more creatures who needed help, more dragons waiting to be rescued, more beings who deserved compassion. And for the first time in his life, Owen felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Outside, the stars shone through the station's viewing ports, vast and infinite. The galaxy was a big place, full of different species and cultures and beliefs. But beneath all those differences was something universal, something that First Leaf had recognized, the capacity to suffer, the capacity to heal, the capacity to choose kindness. And sometimes that was enough to change everything.